Here it comes. And welcome to Inside Music Curation. We're the team at Feed Media Group. We help businesses power music in apps. And we get together on the first Wednesday of the month to talk all things inside music curation. I'm Melissa Clark. I've got my esteemed curation colleagues, Claire, Juan, Mike, all of our some of our professional music curators here on the team to talk today about soundtracks. We like to think of it as kind of the OG music curator, the music supervisors that were creating these experiences and enhancing the online screen experience with the music that you hear in movies and TV. So let's just dive in. I have to say the pre-call for this one was pretty fun. We came up with a lot of movies, a lot of soundtracks, a lot of themes. All the way from, musicals that were obviously like built around, the show was built around the music was built around the show, to soundtracks that, used popular music, to soundtracks that are curating with specific artists. Where do we start? There's some really good soundtracks out there. What was the most interesting thing that correlation that you drew from our pre-call this time, Claire, on the wide topic of music and soundtracks?
Yeah, I think I've always been interested in sort of in being in this line of work per se, that sort of soundtracks were, the first sort of way to put together music from different artists from different times, but giving it a single cultural context, and sort of how that plays across pop culture and people's memories and that being intertwined, I think is really cool. And then I think also it served as a big part of my music discovery process, especially when I was younger and as a kid. And it's sort of an easy way to introduce younger generations to older music, and everyone gets to discover that for the first time. So that was pretty special. And I remember one of the first ones. I had a lot of soundtracks growing up, both like sort of started with my parents. I remember the My Best Friend's Wedding and Tin Cup being two really iconic ones. And like, Say a Little Prayer for You was such a big song of the time. And then even on cassette, I had for this movie called Now and Then, which was like set in the like mid late 60s. So it was all music from that era. And then there was like some flashbacks to the now that was the 90s, and sort of like how those two worlds interplayed. And there was something really special about that soundtrack, and I still know every word.
Yeah, I think both of those points resonate with me. I mean, I was really surprised to think back at my music collection and how many soundtracks I had. And at the time, they're like a very well curated mixtape, right? Like we didn't have shuffle. You could make mixtapes, but they were the mixtape, right? And so it's such an interesting way to discover new music. And also the period piece, right? Like Dazed and Confused was a huge one for me in the 90s, like all the classic rock in there. Juan, any notable soundtracks that from period perspective?
From period perspective, I probably have a whole bunch of them, right? Like Dazed and Confused is a great one. Also Forrest Gump's a great one, right? Like how it travels through time and how it's like telling you this story about how this person grew up, and it's like the music is perfect, right? Each and every moment has that quality of whatever that time period was, right? And then the collection of those, right? It just gives you the auditory like reminder of what all those things look like. When we're talking about, experiencing how Claire was saying that like movies and film, this sorry, I'm a little caught up with my words right now, but like as far as soundtracks, how it's like kind of like one of the first things that children kind of interact with when it comes to hearing music and seeing it overlaid over picture, right? Like when I see my son watch Sing, right, and he's dancing and he's interacting, it's like a music video, right? and that makes it kind of special. I actually wore this shirt today, Purple Rain, because
I wanted to call that out.
on part 2, they have a Prince song on Sing, right? And
which I'm sure was very hard to license.
Yes, she's correct. And, to be able to share that with younger generations and to be able to have that arc of creativity go past just like our generation is a fantastic thing. I love soundtracks. It was long-winded, my bad.
The first one that came to my mind, just in terms of music that was placed in scenes of a film that corresponded to the time that the song was popular, was Goodfellas. It's one of my favorite movies to begin with, but also they would pick these big sort of 50s doo-wop songs in the early days of when the characters were developing, and into the sort of like, okay, now it's the 70s, they're selling drugs, they're sweaty, and there's this Derek and the Dominoes track playing, and like it just made sense. And yeah, we were talking about that in our sort of pre-call, where I'm much more a fan of that as opposed to these sort of films that use sort of modern music over period pieces. Just rubs me the wrong way for some reason.
It has to be done right?
Yeah.
Like, it's so easy to do it wrong. I hate to call out the creator, but when they put down that Radiohead song before they're going into this battle, that's not the right vibe. Radiohead's not battle music, but that's the thing. It's part of the special sauce of having that human connection with that thing that you're watching, right? And it just creates that extra thing.
Yeah, that was part of what, the main thing I didn't love about the Elvis movie was, they had done all these reimaginings of Elvis songs and taking those influences and working with cool contemporary artists. But it almost works better as like a soundtrack inspired by the film and use it in the credits or something. Because when the Doja Cat song Vegas comes on, but they're in Memphis in this scene, just because that's the sample, it just really didn't fit. And I respect Baz Luhrmann a lot and sort of the vision he puts together, but that was kind of a miss for me.
But then there's the other side of that, where a movie can have a soundtrack. I'm sorry, soundtrack that essentially defines it, right? Or even defines a time. My favorite one, I'm gonna pull it out because Claire was like, "Yo, you got to have this on deck."
You have the visual aids. We're ready.
Visual aids. This is one of my favorite movies, but the reason why. Just like my son was dancing, to sing, I was dancing to The Heat Is On. That song bangs, right? And this soundtrack, this movie has stayed with me, and it's something that I'm going to share with my kid, right? And obviously, Beverly Hills Cop is on TNT every other weekend, so it's a cool way of really keeping the conversation of music alive.
Totally.
I love that you brought up dancing, because I think there's also an interesting correlation between movies that are centered around dancing and their soundtracks, like Footloose, Dirty Dancing, Flashdance, Fame. You can tell I was an 80s kid here, but these were all very dance focused music, and the music was key to that, and it just carried on through.
Yeah, it makes for very specific, again, cultural markers, and that I think, the Grease soundtrack, somebody just commented. Oh, that was, there was a road trip. I grew up, in the Bay Area that my mom, my sister, and I drove down to LA, and we listened to the Grease soundtrack 3 times through. That was the distance, because it's a long soundtrack. And same thing, in terms of introducing, the sounds of an era to a new generation. But that one's sort of both on the musical and movie musical side and the time period side. So many things. So yeah,
You
so
can
that's
go down a real rabbit hole on the musicals, right? You've got West Side Story, Oliver Twist, Mary Poppins, Sound of Music, like
yeah.
all of these
To the point of even like we talked about in one of our hip hop IMCs, Jay-Z is sampling Hard Knock Life. So like all of those
Yeah.
things they're really entwined into all parts of culture. And another one that I thought was interesting that I wanted to bring up was the Garden State soundtrack, and sort of that being this like watershed moment for like indie rock into the mainstream. And just having like a specific sound that was mostly the Shins, and being like, okay, this is cool now, and all that, and for a slightly wider audience that then starts to chip away at the indie cred. But
they just did their anniversary tour, right? And like
Yeah.
played tons of shows to all the fans from, that Garden State era.
yeah.
Oh yeah, Singles, right? All the 90s movies. Singles was a big soundtrack. Judgment Night, The Crow, all those fun 90s.
One of the things I really find fun about film, right? I'm sorry, I'm going to geek out for a second because we brought up Grease, right? And I remember I landed in LA. I got down, I had to climb through its fence. I got down to the LA River, and the first thing I thought was like, yes, it's lightning, right? And then my friend told me, hey, this is where they filmed Terminator. And I'm like, what? And it's kind of like how you're able to take the same image, and depending on what the action is, right? And that's a lot of what the work we do, right? It's like taking the action of, whatever that content is and putting that music onto it, right? It's like to think about the same place where you could have had Grease Lightning and Terminator and Blade Runner. That's a cool thought. And the vibe has changed, not only with like the action that's taking place there, but like the music. It's cool.
Yeah, really interesting to think about a single scene and how that translates with the music. What else? Oh, another note that I had on here was talking about, the films that, right, there's films that go and draw from popular music, and then there's films that help, make music that's already been created popular. And then there's the films where they're going out and commissioning, right? And they're saying, hey, Trent Reznor, let's see what you can do with the Social Network, right? Like it was really interesting to see, some of the well-known artists come up and make entire soundtracks from these bands that we're all used to listening to.
Yeah, that's definitely been a newer trend, I think, of like the last 10 years or so, with Kendrick and Black Panther and the most recent Spider-Man iteration and Metro Boomin. And then even sort of, I know Mark Ronson sort of served as the curator supervisor for the Barbie movie in a lot of ways, and getting those artists together. And that was sort of what prompted sort of our thoughts on this being a good theme for this IMC was the Barbie soundtrack, because it's like a lot of original things. You have a very specific subject material, but all the artists took like their own unique angles with it, and but still fits the sort of the vibe of Barbie. So I think even in today's day and age, both of like a streaming music era and a streaming movie era, I think one of the things that actually distinguishes a true blockbuster movie is having a good soundtrack. I don't think you get to like see those movies anymore where it's like, oh, like if it did great at the box office, it also had a great soundtrack that people are talking about. I think that's harder to separate these days.
Yeah, agreed. And also, even if it doesn't do good in the box office, like great, like Clerks, right? Like Clerks is a great movie, has a very whimsical soundtrack to it. I mean, it's not like crazy curated, but it's enough that the film was good, right? They picked music that was like at least leaning on it, and it worked out really well. And was it a blockbuster? Not really, but it was a cult classic, right? Kind of like Aliens and a couple other movies. Back to Claire's point, though, right, about musicians kind of coming, not, well, in a way, for me, it's kind of coming back, right? But in another aspect, it is kind of lost, right? Or not lost, but just like doesn't really happen at all, right? But it was interesting. Yesterday in our pre-call, I busted out this vinyl. It was a Quincy Jones. It's like a blaxploitation genre film, right? And a lot of those films had like Quincy Jones, Little Richard, Roberta Flack, all these people, right? And one of the things that I recognize about that type of soundtracking was that, man, it fit the vibe. You know, you watch those movies now or even today, it still feels great, you know, and I'm so glad that we're getting back to a place where we're having like artists come back, right? With Trent Reznor or Metro Boomin, or there was someone else. Claire, who was the other one?
Kendrick and Black Panther.
Devaka?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
The Sunshine, right?
Yeah. And then Brian just threw in Phil Collins and Tarzan, which is also an iconic one. And that is definitely another album that I had and was sort of even like an interesting bridge from like at least me to my parents of like they knew Phil Collins and then were having to take me to see this movie as a kid, and so they at least could enjoy that part of it too. And that's also it's a really beautiful soundtrack. It'll make you cry in the right.
I mean, let's not forget like Elton John and The Lion King, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Oh yeah.
I was like, huge.
Yeah.
Huge. But you want to know something? I got to be real, right? Since the 90s, have we really gotten a super soundtrack slapper, right? We had, Whitney Houston's
The Bodyguard.
The Bodyguard, right? Then you had Celine Dion's Titanic song.
Mm-hmm.
There you go, right? Even Meatloaf had one. But like in the 2000s and on, it's kind of like there might have been hits, right? But were they as big and as timeless as those? That's an interesting question.
I think, well, this gets into a musical pet peeve of mine, but I think like the Pharrell Happy and like as singles, like if we're talking albums and singles get to like that as a single got a life of its own. And there was another, the Can't Stop the Feeling, that was from the Trolls movie, that sort of like get launched just into their own sort of like pop culture stratosphere. I have a personal philosophy that a song, if it was a theme for an animated movie, it should not be played at a wedding. I have a personal vendetta against those two songs specifically and the amount that they get played on a wedding dance floor. But yeah, their origin is soundtracks. So I think, yeah, individually, like they'll go on to sort of like live in the mainstream and in the culture in that way.
What about these? Melissa, you brought up the Judgment Night soundtrack. That's an instance where that's one of my top 5 soundtracks of all time. I couldn't mention a scene in that movie. Like these iconic soundtracks and like the movie was a total dud, you know? I mean, I'm sure there's instances of those too, but that made me think like, well, that happens too, where the soundtrack overpowers the movie completely.
Scream 3 for me. Thank you for reminding me about that. Scream 3. They did have that Hot Creed track on that one though. So,
well, I will say too, going back to, have we had as big of a hit in the last, 10 years as we did the 20 years before that? I don't know the answer to that. And a lot of it comes down to saturation, right? Like we are consuming content in a totally different way, right? Like I don't remember the last time I've been to a theater. Everything's streaming. And so then the lines get a little blurry too. And then when I think of soundtracks, I start thinking about television because I'm consuming more of that than I am movies. I think that, some TV shows have really upped their game as well. And it's become a really great source of music discovery, right? Like now I can be sitting on my couch at home, enjoying, the 5th season of whatever I'm binging, and a song comes up and I Shazam it. And now, I've just learned about this new artist. So I think in the 90s, I got my, my mixtapes from soundtracks, and now I'm getting exposed to new artists through television and through movies in a way that I wasn't before.
Or old artists, right? I mean, the Kate Bush running up that hill, like that. You're like, oh my God, I remember that song. Or, a younger person who's watching that is like, this is the first time they're hearing that sort of older track.
Yeah, Metallica's got boosted by some placements. It definitely has a power to connect with new audiences. And there's just something about pairing the visual with the audio. And Juan, you guys were talking about with the effect where you get goosebumps.
Oh yeah.
Right. And I've been sitting with that you asked this question like 6 months ago, and I've been noting, like, when have I been listening to music and I get goosebumps? And honestly, like 9 times out of 10, I am watching a music documentary, and I'm not only hearing this artist's performance, but I'm like in their story, and like every time, and there's this visual connection, this story connection that you get. It just really affects me in a different way when that's all happening at the same time.
Yeah, it's really powerful. And I will say, like Shazamming while I'm watching something is a big source of discovery for me. And I know if I'm doing that like multiple times within an episode, then I'm like usually Googling, okay, who is this music supervisor? Because I need to know like what other shows they're working on, because that's sort of its own stylistic fingerprint as well. Is, being able to cater to the visual and cater to the show and do that type of storytelling, but also, be able to show your kind of own style. And I think we didn't drop this one in either, but from a TV perspective, the TV show Nashville the music was produced by T-Bone Burnett. And that was all like a series of original soundtracks where they were commissioning songwriters in Nashville and getting their songs to be recorded by the actors / performers to use on the show. So that was a whole new avenue, for songwriters to get their songs out there and them to have a life of their own. So it becomes an equally important part of the sort of music promotion machine as well.
Yeah, and the creation ecosystem for sure.
Yeah. That kind of hearing you speak about Nashville reminds me of Explosions in the Sky and Friday Night Lights.
Yeah.
That whole pairing, that's still dope. Still dope to this day.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a good point, right? Like, we are a music licensing company, and the core of our offerings, right? And, licensing music is difficult. And so you will see a lot in TV and in films. They're commissioning new music, original music. They're recording covers, right? Like, it's not uncommon to get a music soundtrack that has a cover because they were able to bring in a current artist, use the song that they want, with a slightly easier licensing structure. I just watched the Dolly Parton documentary this week, and that was she was like, oh, it's her first movie. She's like, well, I'll do the movie if I can write the theme song. Yeah. Dolly, watch the Dolly documentary. She had some business sense here. She's like, okay, if I can, and then she wrote it while she was on the set. Like, she used nails as a percussion instrument, and she just was like writing about it on the set, and it became a part of the whole production, and like, took the movie to a whole nother level, really. So it was really interesting to watch.
Yeah. Well, and she, even in writing the song that Whitney Houston performs, was, like, that was another song that, got used in a different movie by a different artist in a different context, but like was her song also. So there's lots of room for that sort of songs getting a new life in different contexts and all that.
Definitely. Closing thoughts before I go around and ask you guys some of your favorites.
Well, I think that this goes without saying, but to Claire's point of who the music supervisor is and how skilled they are, and them knowing the audience, knowing the film, and knowing sprinkling in their own personal flavor. That's important to film and TV, just as what we do for our clients in the fitness world. We need to know who our clients are, who their users are, what they expect to hear when they're doing this type of workout. As like any Joe Blow can't do it. You got to be skilled, and I feel like we've got a great team that does the job well.
It is a real art form, and I appreciate you all. It really, I mean, we say it over and over again here. It's, the right music for the right person at the right time is not always easy, especially when you're curating for large audiences. And it's a real craft, what you guys do.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so let's leave on some of your favorite soundtracks. We'll start with you, Juan.
Attack the Block soundtrack and or legitimately Beverly Hills Cop. But people who make movies, hit us up. Let us take a crack at it. Like, seriously, like they played Radiohead before they're going into battle. Come on, creator. You guys would be one of the better movies this year, but y'all killed me with that. Just letting you know. My hot take.
Claire.
Yeah, I mean, for Full Shot, I feel like I've dropped a lot. I will say, yeah, like the Now and Then movie and soundtrack holds a special place in my heart for that. But I know we talked about sort of like musical movie moments, and I did want to throw out in 500 Days of Summer, the You Make My Dreams Come True Hall & Oates scene is just so epic in like this sort of like mini like true musical within this movie. That just like is one that will always sort of like stick out in my head of like a slam dunk.
I'm gonna go with the single soundtrack. 90s grunge all the way. I also have my first kiss in a movie theater watching the Singles movie. So I feel like that kind of brings back those memories. Dating myself.
Cute.
Not literally, but
And I got to throw it back to, I'm a huge Quentin Tarantino fan, and a lot of it comes down to his soundtracks. I mean, from like, Kill Bill, that has a lot of like some more like, instrumental tracks that were really crucial. Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs are probably two of my most listened to albums in my entire collection. So yeah, huge shout out there. And Eddie Vedder's Into the Wild, that was a big one for me too. He did this beautiful like acoustic soundtrack to that movie, and that one stuck for a long time. Well, we could go on. Obviously, we're at time. There's so much to talk about when we talk about soundtracks. So I have a feeling that this topic will come up again. We'll see. Will the Barbie tracks live on? What will be the next big blockbuster hit that is defined? Eric wanted to shout out Fight Club soundtrack by the Dust Brothers. We had Creepiest Ever, Tubular Bells for The Exorcist.
Yeah.
The Chase for Midnight Express. So, thanks again for everyone for posting your comments. Keep the conversation going in the chat, in the comments, and we will be back to talk about more things music curation. If you want to learn more, you can find us at feedmediagroup.com. Thanks for tuning in, y'all.